The courtroom went so quiet that I could hear somebody's coffee cup clink against the wooden bench in the back row. And the funny thing is, that wasn't the moment the judge started speaking. It was the moment the woman across the room smiled at me and said, "People like you always think the rules don't apply to you." She had no idea that the oldest thing I brought into that courtroom wasn't my temper, wasn't my military record, but a piece of paper folded inside a beat-up metal box that had survived 3 generations of my family. My name is Ethan Walker, and until all this happened, I believed the hardest part of serving my country was spending months away from home. Turns out, coming home can be even harder when somebody else thinks they own your history. I had been overseas for almost 8 months working on military engineering projects, counting down the days until I could sleep in my own bed, drink coffee from the chipped mug my mother always refused to throw away, and sit on my porch watching the sun come up over the old cedar fence my grandfather and great-grandfather built together after he returned from the war. That fence wasn't expensive, it wasn't fancy, and if you asked a contractor, they would probably tell you it needed replacing years ago. But every post had a story, and every scratch had a memory. My grandfather used a joke that if our family ever disappeared, archaeologists would still find those cedar posts, and no stubborn people once lived there. So imagine pulling into your driveway after months away and feeling like something is wrong before your brain can even explain it. At first, I thought it was the angle of the sunlight. Then I thought maybe my neighbor had trimmed his trees. Then I realized there was nothing separating my yard from the sidewalk anymore. I stopped my truck in the middle of the driveway and just sat there staring because the fence was gone, completely gone, not damaged, not leaning, just erased like someone had edited it out of a photograph. Fresh dirt lined the property edge, broken cedar pieces were stacked in a pile, and tire tracks crossed the grass where heavy equipment had rolled through. Taped neatly to my front door was an envelope that looked almost polite until I opened it. Inside was an invoice charging me for demolition services and another document demanding thousands of dollars in violations and penalties. I actually laughed because I thought somebody was playing a prank. Nobody tears down part of another person's property and then sends them the bill. But after calling the phone number, I learned the invoice was real. The woman answering simply said the work had been authorized through the community association and that any questions should be directed to their office. I drove there the next morning wearing jeans and an old ball cap because I figured this had to be some paperwork mistake. The office looked like every small suburban management office in America: fake plants, motivational posters, and a coffee machine that smelled stronger than the coffee it made. Behind the desk sat a woman named Denise Holloway, the association president, perfectly pressed blazer, perfect hair, perfect smile that somehow made you feel unwelcome. She glanced at my paperwork for maybe 3 seconds before sliding it back toward me. "Your structure violated community architectural standards," she said. I looked at her and asked, "My structure? You mean the fence that's been there longer than half the houses in this neighborhood?" She shrugged. "If it's not compliant, it doesn't matter how old it is." I explained I had never received a notice. She clicked her pen and replied, "We mailed multiple communications." I asked where. She answered, "To the property address." I almost laughed again. I've been deployed overseas. Did anyone try calling? Emailing? Certified mail? She leaned back and folded her arms. It's the owner's responsibility to remain informed. There was something about the way she said it that made me realize this wasn't an accident. She wasn't trying to solve a problem. She thought the conversation was already over. As I stood to leave, an older maintenance worker walking past quietly muttered, "I'd keep every piece of paper if I were you." I turned to ask what he meant, but he kept walking without looking back. That one sentence stayed with me all the way home. My mother came over that evening carrying a casserole, because that's what mothers do when they don't know how else to help. She looked at the empty property line and didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then she whispered, "Your great-granddad planted those posts with his own hands." We ate dinner in silence until she suddenly remembered an old storage box in the attic that belonged to my grandfather. It contained tax receipts, faded photographs, letters, maps, and documents tied together with string that looked older than anyone still alive in our family. I climbed into the attic expecting dust and disappointment, but instead I found a dented metal lockbox tucked behind a broken rocking chair. The key was taped underneath with yellowing masking tape in my grandfather's handwriting that simply read, "Don't lose this again." When I opened the box, I had no idea that the fight over a wooden fence was about to become a fight over history, property rights, and the arrogance of people who mistake authority for ownership. And I definitely had no idea that within weeks, people all across our neighborhood would start questioning everything they've been told for years. I carried that metal lockbox downstairs like it weighed 100 pounds, even though it probably weighed less than 10, because sometimes history is heavier than steel. My mother sat at the kitchen table while I spread everything across the surface: old surveys with fading ink, tax receipts from decades before I was born, black and white photographs showing kids climbing over the same cedar fence that had disappeared only days earlier, and finally a folded document wrapped inside wax paper that my grandfather had apparently protected for years. He always told me that our family never owned the biggest piece of land or the nicest house, but we knew where our line was, and we respected everyone else's. At the time, I thought it was just another lesson from an old man who liked talking about the past. That night, those words suddenly sounded like instructions. I unfolded the document carefully and saw the original property deed. The paper was worn, the edges cracked, but the writing was still clear enough to read. There were handwritten notes in the margin from a survey completed decades later, and a reference to an easement agreement that I didn't fully understand. I made coffee, sat down, and started reading everything I could find. Hours turned into midnight. Midnight turned into 2 in the morning, and before I realized that the sun was coming back up. The more I researched, the stranger everything became. The community association governing our neighborhood had been established many years after my family's deed. Their rules were extensive, covering paint colors, mailbox styles, landscaping, and fencing, but the legal language repeatedly referred to restrictions applying subject to existing recorded rights. That phrase kept pulling me back. Subject to existing recorded rights. I called an old friend from my engineering unit named Lucas, who had left the service and become a title examiner. He laughed when I apologized for bothering him and said, "You only call me when something has gone terribly wrong." I told him the story. He became quiet for a few seconds and then asked, "Did they actually remove the fence before proving they had authority?" I said yes. He whistled. "Don't argue with them yet. Get every document you can." Over the next several days, I visited the county records office where an employee named Mrs. Alvarez seemed genuinely interested in helping. She had worked there for nearly 30 years and knew exactly where the old books were stored. She disappeared into a back room and returned pushing a cart filled with oversized record volumes. "Most people never ask for these anymore," she said with a smile. Together, we compared legal descriptions from different decades until she pointed a notation that almost everyone would have skipped. "Look at this reference number," she whispered. It led to another filing confirming that structures existing along the eastern boundary under the original grant retained perpetual recognition unless voluntarily removed by the owner. I stared at the page and asked, "Meaning?" She smiled again. "Meaning if that fence is the same historical boundary structure, somebody may have made a very expensive decision." I thanked her and drove home feeling something I hadn't felt since returning from overseas: confidence. Denise Holloway, meanwhile, seemed to believe I would simply pay and move on. Every letter arriving from the association sounded more threatening than the last. They added administrative fees, legal review charges, compliance assessments, and language suggesting that failure to cooperate could result in additional action. One afternoon, I called the office again, hoping maybe a different conversation would lead somewhere. Instead, Denise answered personally. "Mr. Walker," she said, almost amused, "have you decided to resolve this?" I asked, "Resolve what?" "Your mistake." She let out a small laugh. "Our board unanimously approved enforcement. You should consider settling before court." I replied, "I intend to see you there." She paused and then said, "People usually learn that fighting the association costs more than compliance." I answered, "We'll find out together." The hearing date arrived faster than I expected. Friends told me to hire an attorney, but something inside me wanted to stand there myself because nobody knew the story of that land better than my family. I put on a suit that hadn't fit perfectly in years, polished my shoes, tucked the old deed and every supporting document into organized folders, and carried the dented lockbox under my arm. The courthouse hallway buzzed with conversations about traffic tickets, divorces, contractor disputes, ordinary problems from ordinary lives. Then I saw Denise at the far end, surrounded by board members and a sharply dressed attorney carrying a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. She noticed me and whispered something to the group. Several of them glanced over and smiled in that confident way people smile when they think the ending has already been written. The courtroom itself felt smaller than I imagined. The judge entered, everyone stood, and case after case moved quickly until ours was called. Denise's attorney spoke first. He was polished, organized, and incredibly certain. He described repeated violations, ignored notices, unauthorized structures, and unnecessary resistance by an owner refusing to follow community standards. He presented photographs of my property after demolition, somehow using the absence of the fence as proof that no compliant structure existed. He referenced board votes and enforcement authority. If someone had walked in halfway through his presentation, they would have believed I was the unreasonable one. The judge listened carefully before turning toward me. "Mr. Walker, do you wish to respond?" I stood, thanked her for the opportunity, and began with the simplest question I could think of. "Your Honor, may I ask the association representative to identify when I personally received notice?" Denise answered before her attorney could stop her. "Multiple notices were mailed." I nodded. "Certified?" She hesitated. Standard procedure was followed. Email. Silence. Telephone. More silence. The judge wrote something down. Denise's attorney quickly redirected the discussion toward community authority, explaining that owners have obligations regardless of personal circumstances. Then Denise leaned forward, looked directly at me, and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "People who serve in the military understand discipline. You follow orders there. Homeowners follow rules here. That's how communities work." A murmur spread through the gallery. I felt my jaw tighten for a second, but anger would not help me. My grandfather used to say that the loudest man in the room is usually trying to drown out the weakest argument. I took a slow breath, reached down, and placed the old metal lockbox on the table. The sound echoed through the quiet courtroom. I unlocked it, removed the wax paper bundle, unfolded the deed, and handed a copy to the bailiff for the judge. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "before we discuss their rules, I believe we should first discuss who had rights to this boundary long before those rules ever existed." Denise's attorney leaned toward her and whispered something urgently. For the first time since I entered the building, her confident smile disappeared. The judge adjusted her glasses and began reading while I waited, knowing that the next few minutes would decide far more than whether my family lost a fence. They would decide whether history could simply be bulldozed because someone in a board meeting voted to pretend it never happened. The judge read the first page slowly, then flipped to the attached survey, then back again, and the silence inside that courtroom somehow became louder than any argument that had been made all morning. I could see Denise trying to read the judge's expression, but judges are good at hiding what they think until they are ready to speak. Finally, she looked toward me and asked, "Mr. Walker, would you explain the relevance of this recorded language?" I nodded and walked to the display table, pointing to the survey attached to the original deed. "Your Honor, this boundary structure existed before the association was created. The recorded language states that improvements established along this eastern line under the original grant remain protected unless voluntarily removed by the owner. I never removed it. They did." The judge looked at Denise's attorney. "Counsel, were you aware of this recorded document?" He adjusted his glasses and answered carefully, "Your Honor, we were relying on the association's records." She asked another question that seemed simple but landed like a hammer. "Did anyone verify whether earlier recorded rights existed before authorizing demolition?" The attorney hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to notice. "Not to my knowledge." The judge wrote another note. Denise finally spoke up. Those old documents shouldn't override current community standards. The judge looked directly at her and replied, "Community standards do not erase legally recorded property rights. They exist within them." You could almost feel the air leave the room. I wasn't celebrating because I knew enough about legal matters to understand that one good moment does not guarantee victory. But for the first time since I returned home, I felt that someone with authority was actually looking at facts instead of assumptions. I presented the next document, a title history confirming that the original recorded protection had never been extinguished or subordinated. Then I submitted correspondence showing the association had never sent certified notice before ordering demolition. The judge examined the paperwork and asked Denise whether the board had discussed these issues before voting. Denise answered that they had relied on management recommendations. "Did management review the historical filings?" the judge asked. Denise looked toward her attorney. The attorney looked toward the table. Nobody answered immediately. A quiet chuckle came from somewhere in the gallery before the bailiff reminded everyone to remain silent. The judge then asked me one final question. "Mr. Walker, what exactly are you requesting?" I answered honestly. "I want to be made whole. I want the cost of replacing what my family lost. And I want associations to remember that rules are not permission to ignore the law." She leaned back in her chair for several seconds before delivering her ruling. The court rejected the penalties the association sought to collect against me, ordered reimbursement for the demolition costs, awarded additional damages for the improper removal of the structure, and noted that the evidence raised serious concerns regarding the association's procedures. She finished by saying something I will never forget. Authority carries responsibility. When responsibility is ignored, authority becomes abuse. The hearing ended, but the story did not. As people stood to leave, 3 homeowners approached me carrying copies of old property documents they had brought almost by accident because they had heard rumors that my case involved historical deeds. One elderly man told me his house had belonged to his parents before the association even existed. A woman said she had been paying fines for a detached workshop she believed she had no right to keep. We exchanged phone numbers, and within weeks more neighbors started checking their records. It was like someone had turned on a light in a room that had been dark for years. Families discovered old easements, grandfathered structures, and recorded agreements that nobody had bothered to review before sending violation letters. The association suddenly faced challenge after challenge. Meetings that once lasted 20 minutes stretched for hours. Residents who had never spoken stood up demanding explanations. Copies of internal emails began circulating around the neighborhood. Board members argued with one another about legal expenses and insurance coverage. One message simply read, "How did nobody catch this?" Another asked whether outside counsel had warned them months earlier. The confidence I had seen on Denise's face in the courthouse hallway disappeared from every public meeting afterward. Then another surprise arrived. The association's insurance carrier informed the board that questions existed regarding the handling of enforcement actions and notice procedures. Lawyers became involved. Consultants were hired. Costs climbed rapidly, and those costs eventually landed where they almost always do, on the homeowners themselves. Special assessments were proposed, and suddenly people who had ignored board elections for years became deeply interested in governance. At one meeting, a retired teacher stood up and said, "If they could do this over a fence that stood here before most of us were born, what else have they been doing without asking questions?" Nobody had an answer. A settlement was eventually reached addressing multiple disputes, refunding certain charges, revising procedures, and requiring additional legal review before future enforcement involving historical properties. Denise announced her resignation shortly afterward. She did not look angry when she left the final meeting. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from believing power and being correct are the same thing until reality proves otherwise. A few months later, the replacement cedar post stood where my family's fence had always stood. We reused whatever original wood could be saved, and my uncle insisted on setting one post by hand instead of using equipment. "Your great-granddad would appreciate that," he said. We worked until sunset, covered in dirt and sweat, And when we finished, I stepped back and realized the fence looked almost exactly the way I remembered it as a kid. It wasn't perfect, but neither are families, neighborhoods, or people. Sometimes what keeps something standing isn't that it never gets knocked down, but that someone decides it is worth building again. Every now and then I sit on my porch with that old metal lockbox beside me and think about how close I came to throwing it away years ago, because it looked like nothing more than rust and old paper. Funny how history works. The things that seem useless often become the things that protect you when everything else fails. And maybe that's the real lesson from this whole mess. Communities need rules, but rules should never replace fairness. Leadership needs authority, but authority without humility eventually destroys itself. So now I want to ask you something. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted the fines and moved on? Or would you have fought all the way to court over what many people would call just an old wooden fence? And if you had been one of the neighbors watching this unfold, would you still trust the association afterward, or would you demand new leadership? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments. Because sometimes the most interesting part of the story is not who won, but how different people decide what justice really looks like.